Good morning, everyone. So that we can stay on schedule, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, Molly Krukenberg, Director at the Montana Historical Society, and I want to welcome all of you to the final day of the Montana History Conference. So I do appreciate and thank you all for getting up so early to take in more Montana history. But even if you're still a little groggy, our breakfast keynote speaker, Troy Hallsell, will have you bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in no time with his talk on the fascinating history of Montana's intercontinental ballistic missile program. And that is a mouthful for early in the morning. Before coming to the Air Force as a government service civilian, Troy served in the U.S. Army from 2005 to 2010 as an intelligence analyst. After a stint at the National Ground Intelligence Center in Charlottesville, Virginia, he entered graduate school in 2011 and earned a PhD in history from the University of Memphis in 2018. He's the author of several articles on military, urban, and Western history topics, including some articles in Montana, the Magazine of Western History, and he is a member of the Cascade County Historical Society Board of Directors. Please join me in welcoming Troy.
Morning, everybody. Can y'all hear me? Is it too loud? Is it too quiet? No, okay. Oops, let's see here. Bear with me. Okay. All right, so Molly, thanks for that introduction. I do appreciate it. And thanks everyone for not just coming to the morning talk today, but also just the conference in general, right here in the greatest city of Montana, Great Falls. So before I actually talk about this, how Central Montana got its missile fields, I always like starting with this question. Who here was aware that the Air Force employed historians? Show of hands. Is that because it was in the program? Okay. Usually it's a small number, and that's fine. A lot of folks don't think of the military, let alone the federal government, actually employing historians, but the Air Force and the entire federal government across the executive branch actually employs lots. So for any of the grad students in the audience, it pays more than being a professor. So I'd encourage you to look this route for employment. But before I get into this again, I just want to talk just very briefly about what I do. So as an Air Force unit historian, right, most folks probably think of just your traditional military history, battles, pieces of technology, so aircraft or missiles. And that is some of what I do. In fact, that's more or less what this talk is today. But as an institutional historian, it's really my job to chronicle what the wing does throughout every calendar year. And a lot of it is, you kind of know when something is important. It was actually cool to be a working historian during COVID, to live through something historic, provided me an opportunity to try to understand that and how it affected the Air Force, our unit, etc. But a lot of what I do is also to give talks, like I am today. And so with that said, I'll start talking about the missile program here in Central Montana. One thing I will, just as a caveat on the front end, for anyone who's ever been around the military, let alone in it, the military loves its acronyms. I am going to do my best to explain all of them before I use them, but I guarantee nothing. So with that said, let's get going. So another question, who here knows what the Cold War was? All right, who here lived through the Cold War? Okay, so most folks. I'm 42. I was there for the very tail end of it. And for me, the Cold War, as my parents talked about it, was probably the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard of in my entire life. But as I became a historian, as I started to research it generally, but also specifically for here at Malmstrom, I actually came to understand exactly how big of a deal it was. So for those who may not be familiar with the Cold War, it's less a hot war, even though there are a lot of conflicts in it. But I always called it more of like an international political order that essentially structured, the East versus the West. So the U.S. and its allies, the West, versus the Soviet Union and its allies, also known as the East. And of course, you had your non-aligned or your what we might call third world nations that kind of played each side off of one another. Historians can quibble over the dates, but 1947, 1991 are kind of the agreed upon start-end dates for it. And like I said, it happened everywhere, including right here in Montana. Now, the Cold War had many different facets that fed into it, and so I'm really going to talk about one tiny slice of that. It's nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race. Of course, the U.S. had nuclear weapons in World War II, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union had their own by 1949, and both had thermonuclear weapons by the early 1960s. And according to historian John Gaddis, he said, quote, "The problem was not so much how to defeat an adversary as how to convince him not to go to war in the first place. Paradoxically, that seemed to require the development of weapons so powerful that no one on the American side knew what their military uses might be, while simultaneously persuading everyone on the Soviet side that if war did come, those weapons would, without a doubt, be employed." Today, it's gone by many names. Might call it deterrence today, or mutually assured destruction, or MAD. For anyone who's seen Dr. Strangelove, is probably the much more familiar term. And this kind of logic actually pressed President Eisenhower to prepare for all-out nuclear war. Now, I'll explain this image here in a second. So if nuclear weapons were an integral part of the Cold War, the intercontinental ballistic missile weapons system was an integral part of that nuclear arms race. The U.S. began experimenting with missiles since 1946, when it was pulling German V-2 surface-to-surface missiles off the battlefields of Western Europe and then trying to reassemble them back stateside. In 1951, the Air Force moved forward with the Atlas and Titan ICBM intercontinental ballistic missile systems. And if anybody wondered if this sounded redundant, that's because it was. The logic was that if one didn't work, hopefully the other one did. And by 1954, the U.S. was all in on ICBMs, and Congress dumped tons of money into these programs for research and development and construction. Now, and then the first Atlas Squadron was deployed to Vandenberg, now Space Force Base in California in 1957. However, even before those two weapon systems became operational, the Air Force was already hard at work developing the Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missile. And the Minuteman actually solved a number of problems with the existing Atlas and Titan systems. One is that the Atlas and Titan were incredibly volatile, and they were gigantic. Both those Atlas and Titans, they use this liquid fuel system, and it was very volatile. In fact, on numerous occasions, some of these missiles or parts of it, because of this fuel, exploded on the launch facility, burned up on the launch facility, destroying countless number of support buildings, injuring and killing many, many airmen. And so that solid fuel system actually it was incredibly stable. But not only was it stable, it actually allowed engineers to drastically reduce the size of the Minuteman missile. So for example, the Atlas was about almost 83 feet in length and just over 276,000 pounds. The Minuteman was just under 54 feet long and about 65,000 pounds. And this allowed engineers to reduce overall requirements. It literally required less stuff to make it. It required both smaller and fewer support buildings and structures to operate it, and it just required less people overall. And so for this image up here, so here on the left, we have the different size comparisons of the Atlas and Titan and the Minuteman. Can anybody tell which one is the Minuteman? It's the small one, right? And over here on the top, we have the different launch facilities. And so launch facilities, and I'll explain this a little bit more, is where these missiles basically hang out until they're ready to be launched. And for the Atlas, basically all those first iterations of the Atlas missiles, they more or less hung out above ground. So they just were upright on a launch facility, or they may be kind of prone and then they're brought upright before launching. But with these, once they became upright and ready to launch, literally a fuel truck had to come up and fuel them up before you could actually use them. And of course, you have the Titan and Atlas there on the right. These are actually stored underground, and I don't know if anybody's had the opportunity to actually go to an old Titan missile site. I've heard that they are almost unbelievably large. In fact, my grandfather was in the Titan missile program back in the 70s, I think it was. And she had an opportunity to go into one of these launch facilities as a kid, and it's kind of one of those things you look down and you almost literally can't see the bottom. And of course, we have the Minuteman, the very small Minuteman system there on the far right. Below here is actually the different launch facility configurations. It's not really that important for this talk. I mostly put it in here to take up dead space. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So why did the Minuteman ICBM come to Montana? So the Air Force selected Montana and really the broader Great Plains because it needed wide swaths of sparsely populated land to build this weapon system. In this map here on the right, I'm not sure how clear it is, but kind of the specs you see, right? So these are the different missile fields for the different missile wings back in the early 60s, really through the end of the Cold War. At one point in time, there were 6 missile wings. Now there's 3. But the reason the engineers needed wide swath, or the Air Force needed wide swaths of land is that, well, sorry, let me back up real quick. So just to kind of explain some stuff. So each wing, and so for those in the Air Force, you know what a wing is. If you're in the Army, I equate it to a brigade. Each wing consisted of 3 missile squadrons divided into 5 flights responsible for 10 missiles. And each flight consists of one launch control center, and this is the place underground where the missileers basically work, ready to receive orders to launch a missile. And they were, of course, responsible for 10 launch facilities that house these Minutemen. But the Army Corps of Engineers, it had to space each launch facility 3.5 miles to 17.5 miles away from one another, and then away from its launch control center, and then about 3.5 miles to 8.5 miles apart from other launch facilities. So I kind of use my hand as an example. So if a Soviet missile comes in and takes out this launch facility, it might take out this one and this one, but the U.S. is still able to retaliate from these 2, right? And so if the Soviets wanted to actually completely eliminate a missile field, it would almost have to launch a 1-for-1 to do that. So that's how these things came to Montana. Now, the 341st Missile Wing is known as Wing 1, and I've been there for 6 years. It was about when I was prepping this talk when I realized why we're called Wing 1. It actually had to do because the first Minuteman didn't really work. The Air Force had initially planned to deploy it to Vandenberg, but the first stage booster, and that's that bottom part of the missile. Hold on, let me show you. So this part right here is what we call the first stage booster. That is the engine that gets the launch facility out of the, engine gets out of the launch facility up into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, the first Minuteman, it didn't really work. During a lot of the tests and stuff, engineers realized that there was some sort of technical flaw that reduced the range from 6,300 miles to 4,300 miles, and really the boosters were insufficient to carry the missile over the North Pole to hit its target somewhere in the Soviet Union. So instead of delay the Minuteman program for a year, the Air Force decided to move the first wing up here to Great Falls because it was, I believe, about 600 miles north of Vandenberg, and our roughly 3,500 foot elevation essentially negated that 2,000 foot range loss, at least to the point where the Air Force was confident that if we had to launch those, they would hit something in the Soviet Union. Okay, all right, so this next part is probably, I'm not doing myself any favors here, the most boring part, but I explain it because I do actually frequently get a lot of questions about really this construction process. So before construction actually began, right, the Department of Defense actually had to get the land, right? And so it was a long, slow bureaucratic process in which the Army Corps of Engineers would have to get permission to go do soil samples, right? So if they said, hey, it has to be built here, you got to make sure that ground can literally support that launch facility, that launch control center, right? You don't want it near a fault line. You don't want to put it in the middle of a lake, right? So they have to go make sure that these things, the land can support it. Ultimately, the Corps of Engineers purchased about 2 acres for each launch control center and launch facility and secured permanent easements for access roads to sites, communication lines, and azimuth markers. And in total, it acquired about 5,200 tracts of land, totaling approximately 20,000 square miles throughout central Montana. Once that part was done, the DoD would go in and offer I use quotations here, fair market price to acquire the land in question. And really one of 3 things happened. That property owner would be like, okay, sure, fine, I'll take that offer. or they could reject it and then negotiate for a higher price, and that's what most people seem to do based on some of the legal stuff I've seen. Or they could outright refuse, and then of course the DoD would start a condemnation proceeding and take that land through what we now know as eminent domain. And I'm going to talk briefly about a guy who just was not having this whatsoever. His name is Vernon Taylor. He was the owner of a 25,000-acre ranch in Fergus County. And when he learned that the Air Force was going to put a launch facility on his ranch, he fought it with everything he could. First off, he believed it would interfere with the operation of his ranch. And right, so for him, I imagine that it was hard for him to conceive of what this launch facility looked like. He might have actually thought that it was just like another big Air Force installation just plopped down on top of his ranch. But regardless, he believed that having military stuff on his ranch would make it impossible for him to actually be a rancher. But also, he believed this would disrupt his wife's convalescence, having a launch facility on their property. He said, quote, this would completely destroy the possibility of further help to her if she had to sit on the front lawn overlooking a missile launching base. Like any good American, he lobbied his elected officials, and he met with the Air Force Secretary to relocate this launch facility, but ultimately it went nowhere. Air Force told him if it moved in any direction, it'd either be too close to other launch facilities or near a geological fault. So ultimately, he put his ranch up for sale in 1960 and, quote, hoped to be out before the Minutemen come in. Now, according to Gretchen Hefner, and she wrote kind of the book on the Minuteman program, she said, quote, landowners throughout the missile fields were at least partly right to think that strategic planners and far-off military headquarters were playing God with their pastures. Missile site selection was not based on local needs, but on the suitability for maximum strategic efficacy. Now, for the construction itself, there's a number of players, just so you know who they are. So the Army Corps of Engineers oversaw the entire project. The Fuller Webb Corporation out of California was the prime contractor to build the launch control centers and the launch facility. And of course, Boeing, it had designed the Minuteman, and so it installed all of the technical components and then later on delivered the ICBMs once it was ready. The Air Force broke ground on this project in March 6, 1961, and I got some photos up here I'll show here momentarily. Now for me, when I first started this research project, the difficulty was actually finding people that I could interview that actually worked on this. Because the reality is that your engineers, at least your more senior folks at least, they probably would have been in their 40s and 50s there in the early 60s, and the reality is they're just not with us today for me to do that. But I was giving a very early version of this talk, and lo and behold, I met a second lieutenant whose grandfather actually worked on this project as a contractor. So I got to interview, his name was Jack Gannon, and he was fun to talk to. But the thing that really stood out to me was that working on this project was a huge financial windfall for pretty much anybody involved here in central Montana. You know, he was telling me stories that Boeing, or the Fuller Webb had set up basically a storefront on 10th Avenue South, and there'd be a line of people, you know, a mile long going in there to put in applications to get a job to work on this program. And for him, he actually received a 400% wage increase to be a quality insurance inspector on this project. He had been working in a tire shop making about $1.50 an hour. He took this job making $6.50. And he was probably one of the least paid people because he worked with guys making $15 and $20 an hour in the early 1960s. And the project he worked on, so there's this huge web of communication lines all throughout central Montana that link the launch facility to the launch control center, launch facility, launch facility, launch control center to launch control center. And so that was a project he worked on. It was pretty straightforward, his job. Folks, they'd lay the line, they'd splice it. He made sure the splice was good so that this whole system could talk to each other, and then off he went to the next project. You know, one story he always told me about, anybody who knows that year-round construction in Montana can be a problem, there was not a winter exclusion period. This was a year-round project, and he was telling me stories so many times that the trenching machine would come through, it would snow, and then they spent the next 2-3 days digging ice out, pumping water out before they could actually do their job. But as the Corps of Engineer and the Fuller Webb Company got Malmstrom's missile fields construction underway, the first nuclear standoff of the Cold War took shape and forced Strategic Air Command to bring its nuclear arsenal to an unprecedented state of readiness. And it's not on here, but that's the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'll talk about that in a second. So let me get through some photos here that I've come across. Some were given to me, some I had stored in my archives that I only recently found. So here we actually have a photograph of what I understand to be surveyors coming out to somebody's property and trying to see, hey, what can we do here? So the two folks on the left, now this is kind of informed speculation here. I believe the two people on the left are the property owners. You got the guy in the middle, I think he's the actual guy doing the survey work. And then, of course, the guy on the right is an Air Force representative. This is somewhere in the Alpha Flight area, so that kind of spans from Belt almost all the way down to Neihart, around there. And I think people may recognize that structure, that formation in the background. I believe that's Big Baldy, if I'm not mistaken. And so kind of give you an idea of where this place is. Here's actually the groundbreaking ceremony. It was a big deal. It was at the base theater on base. Yeah. So you got band members, you got people in attendance. Of course, you got all your big wigs, your elected officials, your generals, etc. What I find amusing about this particular photograph in this ceremony, it wasn't a groundbreaking in the traditional sense. You know, you turn over soil. The governor at the time, which I think was Donald Nutter, he basically went up to the podium, pressed a button, something exploded down by Neihart, and that was the groundbreaking ceremony. I don't know if that's actually true or not, because there's no one that, you know, if a tree falls in the woods, right? But this theater is still on base today, and I think we still have the original drapes. So this here is a launch control center under construction. So this piece right here that looks like a capsule, like a medicine capsule, so we call it a capsule. So that's where the missileers hang out, right, at their console to receive commands to launch a missile. The big rectangular thing right there, that is a elevator shaft. So this thing is, I believe, 2 to 3 stories underground. I actually forget. I've been down there before. It's a very slow-moving elevator, so you're better off actually probably taking the ladder to get down there. But of course, construction happens, right, and when it gets filled in, this is what it looks, the finished product looks like. So the Launch Control Center is underneath the structure that we call the Missile Alert Facility. And so the Missile Alert Facility is basically where everybody else does their job. So in there, you're going to have security forces folks ready to respond to alarms as needed. You're going to have a facility manager. They basically manage this whole piece of property. So this could be removing snow, putting in work orders, making sure there's enough fuel there, things of that nature. You're going to have today we call them missile chefs, but just imagine a cook to cook meals for everybody. And of course, you have rooms and bunk beds for everybody to sleep when they're not on duty. This here is the construction of a launch facility, and I've never been able to get the actual definition of what this thing is they're putting in the ground. I just call it the launcher tube because that sounds right to me. But I love this photograph because of the scale, because you see the silhouettes of the people there in the background just to give you an idea of how big this thing is, right? So we're talking, that hole right there is probably a good 90 feet underground, and so when it's all built, it looks like that. Right, so it's hard to see. If you don't know what you're looking at, you don't know what it is. But if you're driving around and once you see an actual launch facility, you realize that they're everywhere. And I think the closest one you can see is actually on I-15 towards Helena, probably about 10 miles out of town. It just looks like a nondescript fence, but that's what they look like. Here we have it's called a transporter erector. This is how basically what we call the downstage. So basically everything but the warhead gets around the missile field. And so in this image here, I don't know if they're emplacing or removing that downstage portion, but it is a very large tractor trailer. And in fact, we just now got our newest part of this program to replace the ones that were delivered, I think, in the 90s. So they're still doing tests on it to make sure it works. So here's the trenching operation, or the cable operation. So here on the left, you know, you got this trenching tractor, whatever you want to call it, basically going through somebody's wheat field, digging the hole, right, to put the cable in. And here on the right is you have guys laying cable. And I actually had the mileage. I think it's something like almost 3,000 miles of cable buried underground in central Montana to make this thing work. And here is the missile fields, both then and today. Later on, the 564th Missile Squadron was built basically north of this red one where it says 12th Missile Squadron around Conrad. All that got deactivated when the Cold War ended and the whole base realignment and consolidation process played out. Let's see. Okay, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this entire piece of defense infrastructure is under construction as the Cuban Missile Crisis kicks off, right? So the Cuban Missile Crisis, kind of in broad strokes here, basically the Soviet Union emplaced about 36 medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, and their roughly 1,300-mile range could hold the entire eastern half of the United States hostage. This began around October 14th, and I'm never sure if the beginning is when the DoD realizes it or when it becomes public knowledge, but I'm going to go with October 14th. Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, he did this to do really three things. He wanted to spread communism throughout Latin America. He wanted to ensure Fidel Castro's communist revolution endured, and he also wanted to project Soviet military strength in the United States backyard. And as you can see in this map, Cuba, if you're not aware, is very close to Florida. So in response, Kennedy, he said, quote, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack on the Soviet Union by the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." Essentially, if they launch missiles at our allies, we're going to send everything we can at them. So again, right, this is October 14th when this begins. But it begs the question, how do you use a new weapon system that was kind of ready? Not really. Because by October 24th of that year, the Corps of Engineers and Boeing, they'd finished building all that concrete and rebar infrastructure in the Alpha Flight area around Belt, Nyhard, et cetera. Boeing had installed all the Minuteman components, but they had done no tests. They have no idea if this thing is going to work, right? It's kind of, for anybody who was in the military, imagine doing a functions check on your M16, M4. You got to know if this thing is going to work as intended. So Strategic Air Command ordered a technical evaluation, but one with the Minuteman locked inside. Let me show you something real quick here. So it's kind of hard to see, and I was trying to show this on the tour on Thursday, but the launch facility trainer unfortunately had mission priorities that they had to do. But this launcher enclosure door right here, and it's kind of hard to see, but it's basically this big white thing, kind of the top center there. It is a 110-ton door made of rebar and concrete. And it's a hardened thing, right? So in case a nuclear blast comes in, it should protect the Minuteman. But it opens one of two ways. You can kind of crank it open for when you're doing maintenance, or if you launch an actual missile out of there, there's an explosive pack that explodes, and that thing goes flying out at something like 100 miles an hour, right? If you're standing in front of that, you will get killed. So in order to do these tests on the Minuteman, maintenance personnel went in and they deactivated those explosive charges, right? So the idea was, let's run through these tests, and if this thing accidentally launches, hopefully it'll just be contained in the launch facility and burn out in there. That did not happen. But if the missileers received an emergency war order, and that is basically the order to launch a missile, maintenance crews would have to reconnect the explosive charges that blew this lid open before liftoff. And according to historian Michael Dobbs, he said, quote, "They had to plug the cable back in, jump into a waiting truck, and run like hell." This suicide squad had a dangerous job. If they were lucky enough to survive an outgoing Minuteman launch, there's a good chance they'd be killed by an incoming Soviet missile. But the wing still had to figure out actually how to launch the Minuteman, because engineers had designed the Minuteman system to require commands from two different launch control centers. So not that there are keys, but imagine both people have to turn the keys, right? So you can't turn one to launch, you got to turn two. Unfortunately, there's only one operational at the time, and I came across this, it was a short speech by the wing commander at the time, Burton Andrus, and the only way he described how they did that is that they kludged the system. I was thinking MacGyver with duct tape and paper clips and all that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, it seemed to work. The first Minuteman went on alert on October 27th, 1962, And 2 days later, the Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles. By July 1963, the wing had all 100 of its 50 Minuteman missiles on alert. This was the first real-world test of the Minuteman ICBM, and it was so successful that the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, he agreed to authorize a 1,000 Minuteman force. So, almost done. So JFK comes to town. So on September 26, 1963, JFK came to Great Falls, Montana, and gave a speech to about 20,000 people at Great Falls Memorial Stadium. And as you can see in the photograph, it was a capacity crowd. You got people just all over the place. And he placed Montana on the front lines of the Cold War. Pointed to the, quote, 100 Minuteman missiles which ring this city, Kennedy called on the 180 million people of the United States to throw their weight into the balance in every struggle on the side of freedom. And as if he contracted both time and space, he pointed to a very grave reality. He said, "We are many thousands of miles from the Soviet Union, but the state, in a very real sense, is only 30 minutes away." Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis helped shift the United States and, of course, Montana to permanent war footing where wartime was always right now. And so this whole episode, both the building of the Minuteman system and the Cuban Missile Crisis, for me, it begs a couple of questions. And so I'm going to talk a bit about how this affected, we'll just call Central Montana and Montana writ large, then also the ICBM mission. Now, for Central Montana, the building of these missile fields actually ended up making much of Great Falls, Cascade County, and to a lesser extent, the 7 counties within the missile fields, much dependent on military spending for its economic development. And while there's not a whole lot of episodes in it, or examples in it, in this immediate aftermath of this, when I was doing research on basically the end of the Cold War and the drawdown, folks in Great Falls were doing everything they can to keep every single bit of defense spending in town. And this is something that plays out over and over again, not just in Montana, but throughout the entire United States. But the Cuban Missile Crisis effect on the ICBM mission was a bit opposite of what people might expect. Now, many people think of the Cuban Missile Crisis as the Minuteman's apex. In a lot of ways, that was the case. But it also fomented the ICBM mission's decline. It persuaded both the U.S. and Soviet Union that nuclear weapons presented a threat to both sides equally rather than to one another separately. It, quote, provided a glimpse of a future no one wanted, of a conflict projected beyond restraint, reason, and the likelihood of survival. JFK, he ended up removing both the Atlas and Titan I from the Air Force inventory. And then as the Vietnam started to pick up steam, he ordered 1,700 qualified pilots back to flying duty, effectively gutting the ICBM field of all of its experienced mid-level officers. Now, as the Air Force put its efforts back into flying missions, it effectively ignored the career field for the rest of the 20th century. Now, these factors from the 1960s, left largely unattended by leaders in the Air Force, provided the foundation for the mission's post-Cold War problems. And here, I'm sure folks here have heard pretty much all of these. There is the misplacement of, so this is kind of the early 2000s, there's the misplacement, in quotations, of 3 warheads. They were being shipped from Minot to Barksdale for destruction, but no one knew where they were for about 3.5 hours. Also, some warhead components got shipped to Taiwan, mistakenly labeled as helicopter fuses. There was, and this is something folks here locally may remember, a big cheating scandal at Malmstrom Air Force Base with missileer qualifications. Essentially, everyone got fired. And I would even argue the fact that the Air Force is still using the Minuteman III points to the fact that this mission has been largely ignored by the Air Force. Now, there are changes on the horizon, so anybody who may be aware of the new Sentinel ICBM under development, this will replace the Minuteman ICBM. Of course, this is up to Congress and how much money and for how long they will fund that program. I take the stance of I believe it when I see it. Now, what the Sentinel means for Great Falls, Cascade County, Central Montana going forward, ask me that question in about 30 years. All right, folks, that's all I got. I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have. What you got? Any questions? All right. Oh, we got one in the back. It's not on yet.
Good morning.
Morning.
Oh my goodness. So I'm an Air Force brat. My father flew B-58 Hustlers, which were the first supersonic planes that carried nuclear weapons. How many nuclear weapons are still in place and operational in Montana today?
That is a great question, and I cannot answer it. Also, this is the answer to most of the questions you're going to ask, so go ahead. Anybody else?
The picture you had with the long tube, and somebody has probably already pointed this out to you, but I assume that was the rebar cage going down before they poured concrete around it. Is that fit?
That is what it is. It's kind of hard to tell in this photograph, but you actually do see the rebar all the way around it. It's kind of got this, honeycomb's not quite the right word, but to my understanding, that's what it is. I just never actually knew what the exact term was for that. Every time I asked maintenance people, they said something else, so it led me to believe that they didn't know.
I actually grew up at this time, and we had, I lived in central Montana, but it's south central Livingston, Montana. And we had, it was a civil defense, I think, or something it was called. And we would go up to the top of a hotel in our apartments in Livingston and wait because they were afraid that maybe they wouldn't get the bombs or the missiles or whatever from Russia in Great Falls, and they might come near Livingston. And so we would have to recall and report what the planes looked like that flew over and everything. And it was a very scary time. And I remember dreaming at night of being bombed and everything. It was a very frightening time in my life. So anyway, others may remember being part of that civil defense. And I have a signed statement that I was part of the Air Force or something.
Thank you. And in fact, is John Axline, is he in here? He's not? Okay, well, he wrote an article about some of those programs and civil defense stuff. I think it came out about 10 years ago. That kind of gets into that. I forget what it's exactly called, kind of a spotter program. We need to learn the different silhouettes of aircraft so you can identify U.S. versus Soviet. And so if you are doing the lookout, you can call it in.
Why did we crawl under our desks in school? Because what this made me think, I shared a bedroom with my sister, and I tried to figure out whether it's better to be on the top bunk or the bottom, because the bottom would mess your whole body up with, you know, the springs, but then you'd be closer to the bomb on the top one. So was that just to make people feel like there was something they could do? I didn't mean that to be funny.
So I actually haven't really looked into a lot of that civil defense stuff and a lot of the rationale behind it. Well, it's such a history nerd thing. One of my favorite pastimes is actually to go on YouTube and watch old Cold War era public service announcements. They are some of the most, nowadays it seems to be some of the most ridiculous stuff, but as far as the duck and cover, right? So I did listen to another historian who studies just kind of nuclear weapons in general. And so yeah, so if you're in school and they tell you to get on the desk and the nuclear warheads hit your school, that's going to do you no good whatsoever. However, if that is something that does explode close-ish, I'm not really sure how far away we need to be far enough away to where the initial blast wouldn't be that devastating. The actual duck and cover, it can do a number of things, right? So when that warhead goes off, if you're looking at it or if you're close enough, it really can burn your skin. So that's one thing. If you're actually ducking and covering, you can protect yourself a little bit. But a lot more is for people that are a bit further away, just all that debris that would fly everywhere, right? The ducking and covering actually can help protect you from some of that debris that does indeed blow out, right? Because the ICBM warheads, they're not huge, gigantic ones like what we had in I think it was Ivy Mike, the first nuclear, thermonuclear one, or like the Soviet Tsar Bomba that went off, I think, in the early 60s. The warhead payload is relatively small, especially by comparison. So when it would come to the duck and cover, as long as you're not directly impacted or hit by a warhead, conceivably doing something like that could actually help protect you from basically a lot of the other stuff. Now, that doesn't do anything about long-term fallout and all that kind of stuff, but just to try to survive the initial blast, it can help.
What about if you lived in the DC area? Hopeless?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Yes.
I remember doing the plane spotting, the civil defense in Great Falls, and I wonder if anybody else here did, because we went to the top of a building, but I can't figure out what building we went to the top of.
Yeah, so she was actually saying the same thing about the airplane spotting and civil defense. Again, I haven't really looked into that. It's some of those records, it's hard to kind of track that stuff down, because a lot of times I'm limited to newspapers, and about what I've seen in regards to that is like, hey, training for civil defense airplane spotting. That's kind of the extent of it, right? So I know it's a thing, I know it's going on, but kind of the ins and outs and a lot of the details is actually something I've struggled to find evidence of. All right, let's do
two questions.
Yeah.
Did you say 20,000 square miles of facilities in?
So the 20,000 is it's a squishy number,
Okay.
right? Because it's a combination of, there's what the Air Force owns as real estate, but then there's
Right.
easements. And I've never gotten a clear answer. Is that kind of like literally 20,000 square miles in total of all that? Or if you drew a circle around all of it, is that 20,000 square miles? So I've never actually gotten a clear answer on that one.
And second question, you said that a lot of private land was acquired, but was there any federal land like Bureau of Land Management or Forest Service land as part of this?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
Maybe some Forest Service stuff just because the Alpha Flight is down there towards Monarch and Nighthawk, but I'm not entirely certain kind of where the Forest Service lands begin and ends.
All right, I've got 3 more comments, and then we're going to wrap up.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay?
In the map you showed of the multi-state impact of the ICBM on the land, in the replacement of these ICBMs with Sentinel, is it in that same area? Is that whole same area impacted? And how has the Air Force, what have they learned about dealing with the public over that 50, 60-year period of time? And what lessons are you implementing now?
So as far as what's being reused, so the missile fields at Malmstrom here in Great Falls, or here in Montana, Minot, North Dakota, and then F.E. Warren, which actually, if you see, it spans 3 states, which makes that construction project a bit more difficult. So yes, so the Sentinel will go back and use that, but the weapon system itself is still under development. So it's kind of one of those things that the engineers are still learning what is actually needed. What can we reuse? What do we need to just completely tear up and rebuild? So that process is ongoing. Like my understanding, I think that that missile engine has had a test or 2, so it's still a very long ways away from actual development. So it's kind of one of those, I'm watching it with rapt attention, just like most other people might be if they're interested in it. And what was the second question? I forgot.
Public interaction.
Oh, so as us Air Force historians, we are continually reminding the Pentagon that there are historians within the United States Air Force, and they should turn to us for lessons learned about stuff from the past. So what I found is, at least at the wing here, the wing leadership at this level is actually, they're like, hey, Troy, what do you have on this, blah, blah, blah. How can we learn from this? So I've been informing folks locally, but the way that the hierarchy works for these development systems, it's so far and wide. Just because my boss knows about it doesn't mean his boss or that person's boss or that person's, you know what I mean? So it's a work in progress. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Norma Ashby Smith, and I want to tell you about the experience I had in the early 60s about being the first woman to go down into Alpha 1. And I did everything except I did one thing wrong. My reflection was captured in the mirror. And in those days, women were not allowed in the missile sites. And so they had to go back and reshoot the segment that we did. But at any rate, it was a very exciting moment, and I'll never forget it.
Thank you.
Troy, you just alluded to the fact that the Air Force has historians, and so you have counterparts at all the bases, and can you tell us a little bit about how, I mean, taxpayers are paying for historians of the military. Are they in every wing of the military, and how many are there?
So in the military we have billets, which is like the job that can be filled, right? And then there's whether or not it's filled, right? So I think the Air Force History Museum program, I saw these stats a few weeks ago, I think has right now like 350 people in the entire program. And that includes museums and our archives, so on and so forth. To my knowledge, every wing has a historian position. Now, whether or not it's filled, you know, that's who knows, right? It could be not filled for several reasons. It's typically, if it's empty, it's because somebody has left and they haven't hired their replacement. And for me, I'm the only historian for this entire base and wing, right? And so it's kind of a side question that that I'd kind of read from it, is that, you know, for us historians, we're really scrambling to try to understand all this kind of stuff so we can create hopefully useful products and send them up. But as far as the program goes, there's a lot of, if you go on usajobs.gov, you will with a lot of frequency, and you just type in historian, all the historian positions will pop up all throughout the Air Force, actually all throughout the federal government, and there's always probably 5 or 6 that are there. And within the Air Force, we do have an internship program where you kind of come in. So for someone maybe with like a bachelor's or something, they can come in and they slowly, over the span of like 3 or 4 years, actually go up in the pay scale pretty quickly. Oh, and if anybody's interested, especially for master's students, the Air Force will pay for you to get a PhD in history. So if anyone's interested, there's a lot of educational growth that you can do. That's my job pitch for the program.
I think we do have time for one more question.
And she's gonna, if anybody does have questions later, that's my office phone number. I would recommend just sending me an email to that. I haven't figured out in 6 years how to make my voicemail work.
Molly's going to regret this. Okay, so I have a question about the past history of the future. Could Zephram Cochrane fit in the nose cone of a Titan II missile to launch the Phoenix in Star Trek?
Nice. Thank you. All right, folks. Well, thank you. I do appreciate it. Thanks for your time. Y'all take care.